If we could, I'd like to switch gears a bit and talk about the boundary between the subject and the object and the question of boundaries in general. And to do this specifically by speaking about Catherine Hayles. In My Mother Was a Computer, she suggests that cybernetics helps disrupt the Cartesian generative equation between scientific mastery on the one hand and the constitutive subject on the other by inaugurating what she calls a feedback loop, and what cyberneticians call that too. Connecting, quote, human and machine, dominator and dominated, subject and object. Practically, the production of this effective cybernetic apparatus gives rise, in her view, to a phenomenon of intermediation, by which she means a circuit of nonlinear and recursive exchanges between bodies, texts, and media. And so two questions arise here. The first one is methodological. First, what is the importance of a contemporary infrastructure of digital connection in Hayles' conception of the coproduction and coevolution of multiple causalities? That's the methodological question. And the practical one is, how do network connections, maybe of the sort that you were talking about in the East, complexify the subject-object relationship? Is connectivity in and of itself a technological form of relationality?
Well, that's really nice. Yeah, so for the first question, in Hayles' perspective, is that we live today in what she says the dominant ideology of the world. Technological ideology of the world is what she calls a regime of computation. And it's interesting, her understanding that she approaches the question of regime of computation. She doesn't approach it either as a technophobe, and she certainly doesn't approach it with a bended knee. She makes it the computation complex, and she does this by always keeping in mind her ground thinker, who's Lucretius. She goes back thousands of years, and she's always thinking of this text, I think anyway, of De Rerum Natura, and his book on nature and life. And Lucretius had this basic insight. Lucretius was living in a time of atomic physics and metaphysics, which everyone felt physically the world operated with great sense of regularity, of natural regularity of nature itself. Lucretius didn't agree. Lucretius introduced this concept of complexity. He says, the raindrops may fall, the sky may fold around us, but there's always the unexpected perturbation, what he liked to call the swerve in human existence itself, the unanticipated, the moment of the chance occurrence itself. And Catherine Hayles, when she approaches a regime of computation, she shares, like with a thinker like Jean Baudrillard, the sense that the regime of computation is based upon a self-inflated ideology of completeness, that there is kind of these feedback loops which run with great regularity itself, loopy into the system. Except what both of them notice, but draw very different conclusions from this, is that there's always the swerve, there's always complexity. And Hayles' concept, Hayles' translation of Lucretius's notion of the swerve are terms like bifurcation, perturbation, the unexpected, complexity itself. And she then proceeds to do a really materialist analysis of what this feedback loop is, as you have text and machine and code itself, and begins to show that that the regime of computation moves in unexpectedly novel directions at sometimes, and other times moves with truly demonic forces in terms of organizations and powers itself. And she actually has written her autobiography on this. It's called a small book called Writing Machines, which she did with a designer, in which she then schizophrenically splits her own personality into Catherine and Kate. And Kate, the girl in Missouri, who's really writing in terms of the tapestry of the land and her feelings, and Catherine's the social scientist, the English professor who's holding off from afar. And I thought, wow, this is a fabulous notion of it shows the literacy, it's a literate expression of the notion of complexity itself. She's made herself into a broken feedback loop in some ways. So she's not giving back to the machinery of code what the machinery of code intends to deliver her. It takes her off into interesting directions. So that's in terms of the introduction of complexity. What she is really what she has always said would be admirable to aspire to. That is, she's a creative post-human subject. A creative post-human subject attempts to do this. It wants to do something really creative and novel with notions of complexity and chaos, while avoiding catastrophe and ultimate breakdown or crashes on the other hand. And the creative post-human subject doesn't, and I think that's the whole pedigree, a very intellectual pedigree of writing, from writing machines through how my mother was a computer, how we became post-human. In many ways, that's a crystalline question, which is the expression of that. So Catherine Hayles doesn't deliver us, though, to a culture of connectivity. She delivers us to a culture, beautifully, of broken connections. Broken connections which then turn into swerves. They have I've always found her writings a kind of drift. Here she's the great theorist of the regime of computation, and she delivers us into the nameless. What Heidegger called the nameless. She delivers us into a culture of code drift, basically. And it's a beautiful culture of unexpected things, and that's why she goes to what she calls her tutor texts. And her tutor texts are oftentimes drawn from art, but typically from literature. What happens to when stories are written within the digital medium itself. And those stories within the digital medium will oftentimes be about what Christable would call the whore, the power of the whore within the digital medium itself. Interesting things begin to happen.
So in the context of a network society, then, when connectivity is the norm, the act of creativity, the swerve, comes in an act of consciously breaking those connections. That's what complexifies them?
No, because I don't think so. I think a code drift is set apart by the process itself. The thing about power and the norm is that they get bored with themselves. This language Buddha would call the regimes of intelligibility. Baudrillard would call it the terrorism of the code. Nicholas Luhmann, the sociologist, would call it societies of systematicity and all those kind of things. And it leads one to believe that these apparatuses of power really care about coherence and identity. I don't think that at all. I think the history of the human experience is replete with the fact that power gets bored with itself. Ideologies get bored with themselves. Process of normalization just can't wait to be abnormal as possible. There's even like a theoretical way of describing this, but in The Psychic Life of Power, that's why Judith Butler ruled. She reads Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals and takes from that Nietzsche's really profound insight that power never seeks to totalize itself in the end. Just at the moment of its greatest totalization, power always turns back on itself. It turns back on itself, begins reworking itself, begins to undermine itself. Nietzsche says, we work to make ourselves sick. And I think that insight carries into the culture of the code, into the language of a regime of computation. The regime of computation also works to make itself sick or make itself fun or make itself interesting in some ways. It seeks to undermine itself. That's the notion of code drift. And this even has a scientific basis. In the language of biology, there's a concept today known as genetic drift. And genetic drift says that in addition to the theory of evolution, that there's a real occurrence of simply unanticipated biological occurrences. Accidents happen in the story of evolution. Mutations begin to appear. Things begin to move in a different direction itself. These are not subjectively constituted, they're not subjectively chosen pathways. They're in fact part of the process of life itself. I think in a regime of computation, this process of code drift and genetic drift is alive and well.